Well, my talk today was going to be about how to be a dick for liberty, so I guess I'm going to change my...
Don't worry, Tim, we're live.
Oh, sorry, we're live?
I don't care, free speech.
Thank you, Robert. Thanks for coming all the way from New Mexico, by the way, to do this. This is fantastic. And Toastmasters is obviously paying off for you. That was a good speech and a reminder to me to, okay, let's be nice, let's be respectful. Okay, I'll try not to be addicted. You called me professional. I like how you framed it. You set me up here. I'm going to be talking about making a case for radicalism today. And so, this is a reminder that you can be a radical without being a douche. And so maybe I'll amend the title to be how to be or the case for respectful radicalism or something like that. But I'd also like to acknowledge the Fountainhead Network for putting this on. I think this idea of a space where free thinkers and entrepreneurs can go and work together is a fantastic idea. I've seen similar ideas before. I was in Montreal, and there's a place called the Bitcoin Embassy, where they have a similar space for Bitcoin and cryptocurrency entrepreneurs, and they have a guy there working on seasteading and people working on creating some kind of an off-the-grid network of like antennas between all these buildings in Montreal, so if the internet ever goes down or they want to have their own internet. I can't remember what it's called. I'm not nerdy enough. I feel like a bit of a boomer. Yeah, it is. Yeah, what she said. Yeah. And this is a great. I've often thought that the path to liberty is probably going to be found in innovations that make the state irrelevant, and I think this is a great idea. We even thought about this idea in Calgary. I had some investors. We were looking at commercial space downtown to create a kind of an incubator space for liberty-oriented businesses and entrepreneurial ventures. So it's great to see other people have thought of the same thing, and good ideas, I guess, are infectious, right? Okay, so I'm going to be making the case for radicalism today, and I think in order to set the stage here, we have to take a pulse of where we're at in society. And to kind of highlight this, there's a story I like to tell, and pardon me if you've ever heard it before, but I think it's a good story, and I think it's illustrative of where we're at. A lot of you may know that in my day job, I'm actually a firefighter. I'm a firefighter paramedic, and so I like to think that I fight the forces of chaos in all walks of life, and that fighting these mindlessly destructive forces. Well, I'm essentially acting like a firefighter when I do political action. But a number of years ago, I was called to an apartment fire. It was on the 4th floor, and I was a fire lieutenant at the time, and I was tasked with taking my fire team to the 4th floor to find the suite that was on fire and perform search and rescue and primary fire suppression. So we get to the 4th floor and we see smoke chugging out of one of the doors, and we recognize, okay, that's obviously the room that is on fire. We kick in the door and we start doing a search for victims. And I wasn't expecting to find anyone. Usually people have evacuated by the time the smoke alarms, by the time we get there. But to my surprise, as I came into the living room, through the smoke, I saw a lady lying there on the couch. And she was a very large lady, probably about 350 pounds, corpulently obese, buck naked, and she looked dead. She didn't look like she was breathing, she wasn't moving, and I thought, oh, we're going to be doing a body removal here. And so I went up to her, and as I approached her, I could see signs of her addiction to immediate gratification everywhere. There was a bunch of empty Cheeto bags on the floor around her. In fact, she had Cheeto crumbs in her rolls. I saw...
That's more information than we need.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to paint a picture here, Dan, all right? I'm trying to paint a picture. You need to get this picture to understand why radicalism is so important. There was a number of empty vodka bottles beside her. There was empty cigarette cartons. And I leaned over her, and she looked lifeless, and I pinched her trapezius. That's what we're trained to do, little nerve pinch there, kind of like the Vulcan nerve pinch. And to my surprise, her eyes popped open. And I yelled at her through my mask. I said, "Lady, we got to get out of here. Your apartment's on fire." And she looked up at me, and she realized that there was a firefighter, and might I say, kind of a hunky firefighter, leaning over her, face to face, nose to nose with her, and she said, "Come here, honey," and she grabbed me around the neck and pulled me in and tried to smooch me through her mouth. She wanted to make out such there in the middle of this burning apartment. That's how ingrained this addiction to personal, to immediate gratification was. So I pushed back. I said, "Lady, we gotta go. Your apartment's on fire. Let's go. Let's move." And she grabbed me again and pulled me in. And I pushed her away and said, "No, we gotta go now." And when she realized she wasn't going to get what she wanted, her face became this mask of just utter contempt to me. She curled up her lip, gave me the middle finger, and said, "Fuck you." And I'm going to be honest here. I violated the non-aggression principle, and I grabbed her by her arms, and I forcibly drug her through this smoke-filled apartment that was on fire, out to the safety of the hallway, put a blanket on her, called for EMS to come up and get her. And I grew up in the 80s and 90s when there was a show on TV hosted by William Shatner called Rescue 911. Does anyone
I remember
that?
Show, yeah.
And at the end of each episode, after the firefighter or paramedic saved a life, there was always this great thanks and hugs and a barbecue and celebration of this heroic feat. I didn't get any of that. I got another "fuck you" as I went back into the apartment and put out this fire that she had started. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is kind of what it's like being the leader of the Libertarian Party of Canada. We see exactly what's going on here, right? There's a fire, there's an emergency. And that emergency was caused not by the proximate cause of the cigarette in the mattress. Okay, that's could be seen as the cause, but there was a number of steps, thousands of tiny steps that led up to that, all the way back to maybe a childhood, a terrible childhood or something like that, but also this environment that inculcated dependency, that made her helpless, that divorced her from any sense of responsibility for the poor decisions that she was making in her life. I sometimes wonder, well, where is that lady now, and what would have been needed to avoid this catastrophe? Because again, it wasn't that one irresponsible decision. It was death by 1,000 cuts, really, that led to that giant bubble of chaos finally erupting in this billowy apartment on fire. And so let's take a look at where we're at in Canada. Okay, we have over $4 trillion worth of unfunded liability in Canada at all levels of government. Okay, this is about, I think it's around $300,000 or $400,000 per person that we are in debt, or that we owe in terms of unfunded liabilities that governments have enslaved us to. That has got to be paid somehow, or it's got to be ameliorated somehow. That cannot be sustained. We are taxed at, well, when you add up all the taxes, I think it's close to 50%. I think that the Fraser Institute estimates around 44%. Dan, you probably know the figures. When you add up all the taxes, that's how much of our labor is taken from us, or how much of our property is taken from us. We can't put what we want into our bodies. We don't have a strong constitution that protects property rights, so we can have our pipelines blockaded, but we can also have our land expropriated to build pipelines at the same time. So we have our rights taken away from us left, right, and center. And this didn't just happen overnight. Where we're at now, it appears that Canada, our nation, maybe even Western civilization, to a lot of us it appears like things are on fire. You know, there's a debt bubble in the U.S. It's just a matter of time before we see monetary collapse. And again, this didn't happen overnight. So how did we get to this point? How did things build up like this? And I'm going to argue that public choice theory has an explanation for how government grows like this. And the way government grows is, if you're a dairy farmer, you have a lot to gain by promoting supply management in the dairy industry, right? You can make millions of dollars. And once you start making millions of dollars because you've convinced supply management to you convince politicians that they can get your support in exchange for supply management, you will fight tooth and nail to keep that. Meanwhile, the rest of us, the entire population, pays a few extra dollars a year for milk, right? We don't really notice it in our pocketbook. So we don't have the same motivation to fight against supply management and to defend against that incursion on our liberty. You might say the same thing about LED light bulbs. You might say the same thing about baby walkers or lawn darts. You can say the same thing about almost every industry across Canada. Every special interest group has an extreme motivation and incentive, and they profit immensely by lobbying the government and by promising politicians that they will get support and therefore political power if they get their one little regulation or law in place. The rest of us don't really notice it. We don't really care because it doesn't really affect us immediately. Maybe it'll cost us $1 a year or a few cents a year. And so this is how liberty dies. It dies the death of 1,000 cuts rather than one fell swoop. And at some point there will be a moment where it'll seem like everything catches on fire and chaos erupts as the bubbles burst, but really that process started years and years before by all these small incursions, this immediate gratification at the expense of the liberty of others, a small amount of liberty, but that small amount of liberty adds up to a huge bubble, and we end up where we're at now. And it's not just public choice theory. I think there's also a cultural explanation for this. Because if you look at who is in charge of culture right now, or who's having the biggest influence, it's pretty clear to see that it's radical leftists. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
They're in universities, they're in the media, they're everywhere. It seems we're getting this radical leftist message. Meanwhile, conservatives are trying to push back against this, and they're advocating for status quo. Like, we don't need this change. This is crazy. Let's stop, right? And here's how it looks. If we start at 0 and 10 is like radical leftism, conservatives find a compromise at about 5. So they kind of slow. The leftists don't get everything they want, right? So it grows in increments. Maybe it's 5 this time, but now the scale is no longer 0 to 10. Now it's 5 to 15, and leftists are pushing for that 15. It's the radicals that are pushing for that extreme. And so conservatives are trying to conserve things, but they're reasonable and trying to compromise and pushing status quo. And this has caused and this was noticed years ago, like over 100 years ago. There was a pro-Southern intellectual named Robert Louis Dabney who wrote this in 1897, just as progressivism was gaining a hold in America. He said, "American conservatism is merely the shadow that follows radicalism as it moves towards perdition. It remains behind it, but it never retards it." And this is kind of where we're at right now. We have conservatives that are relatively impotent to do anything. This has caused Michael Malice to quip that conservatism is just progressivism driving the speed limit. They're completely impotent to slow down the growth of the state, and that's because they are trying to preserve essentially progressivism from 10 years ago, the status quo from 10 years ago, or at best last generation. I mean, even make America great again kind of is hailing back to a time when things were better, right? And again, it was still progressive. The progressives, I mean, I'm sure Trump doesn't want to go back to the days of slavery, but maybe the 50s or 60s. But the welfare state was in force then, right? And so he doesn't want to repeal that stuff, but just maybe a few decades back. So that's where we're at, and this is why conservatism, I think, is fairly, is just like Michael Malice said, progressivism driving the speed limit. And I've always believed this. My liberty journey, I became familiar with Ayn Rand's work and was sold on objectivism, and then I discovered Rothbard and went a step further, like a lot of us. And I was very I wanted to run for office as soon as I discovered this stuff, and I said, you know, these ideas just make sense. If we could just get elected, we can make a change. Well, that was very quickly knocked out of me by other libertarians and anarchists that said, well, political action, you can't do anything with that. Like how our politicians are completely impotent. If you understand that politics is all about quid pro quo, right? I have to laugh at this idea of indicting Trump on quid pro quo. What do you think? All politicians do that. It's all quid pro quo, all the way up and down the line. I mean, that's how you get elected. That's the only way to get elected, is essentially to reflect culture and give people something in exchange for their vote. And so I realized very early on in my liberty journey that it's really culture that matters, that we're never gonna have a restrained government unless we have a culture that says liberty or death, that we need to push back against the state, the idea of the state, not because getting elected doesn't get us anywhere. We can't legislate freedom if culture wants statism. And so culture comes first. And later on, a few years later, Andrew Breitbart is credited with coining the term that government is downstream from culture. And I think he was right. I think government is downstream from culture, and so we need to focus on that culture. And so how do we focus on that culture? What is it that changes culture? And what is culture? Culture is what you and I believe, what's in our hearts, what's in our minds. And it's the aggregate of that. The description of that is culture. And you could say that Canada is a very left-wing culture. I mean, to be Canadian is to support socialized medicine, for example. You cannot disagree with that and ever expect to get elected, for example. So culture is very pro universal health care or socialist health care. Well, how do we change that? Do we get someone elected to government? Do we imagine that they can repeal socialized medicine somehow? Well, no, we have to have a culture that demands government do that. And politicians are simply meeting a cultural market demand, and they're reflecting culture. That's how they get elected. So our job then, if our job is not to get elected, it's to, you know, it is to make more libertarians. Because until we have a libertarian culture, we won't have a libertarian government. At least that's how I see it. And this isn't to denigrate people who try to get elected. You know, I think that there are libertarian Conservative Party members. I do. I think, you know, Scott Reed is probably fairly libertarian, Pierre Poilievre. There's a guy, I can't remember, from Edmonton. There's a member of Parliament who I believe is libertarian. He was wearing a shirt that said, "Taxation is theft" on an airplane, and he got all sorts of grief from the local media about that, and he had to backpedal and say, "Oh, I don't really believe that. It's just, you know, it's just a talking point, something to stimulate discussion." But I think I know he actually believes that. I think he knows that taxation is theft, and he was trying to make a point. But again, for him to keep his job, he has to be completely impotent when it comes to culture. He can't challenge culture in any way. He can't go out there and say taxation is theft and expect to win any elections. So he backs off. But that's really what we need to do. And so I look at who it was that made a difference in terms of liberty. Who was it that changed my mind? Was it the incrementalists who said we just need a little bit less taxation, a little bit more freedom? Or was it Ron Paul? Was it Ayn Rand? Was it Murray Rothbard? And I have to be honest with myself, it was those radicals, those people that were unapologetic. I mean, Ron Paul stood on that stage, surrounded by Republicans, and asked the audience, how many people here would do heroin if heroin was legal tomorrow? That was a beautiful moment. No one raised their hands. He's like, okay, why do we need a law for this? If you're telling me, you know, he's the only Republican that said, we need to bring all our troops home. We need to stop these crazy wars of invasion. He's the only Republican that said we need to abolish the income tax. We need to abolish the IRS. We need to, you know, abolish central banking and go to a gold standard. He was a radical. I mean, by all intents and purposes, he was a radical, and people loved him, and they adopted him. And by the way, to our wonderful MC's point, he said taxation is theft, but he said it in a nice way. He said it in a respectful way. He said it in a way that didn't turn people off. People could see that he was authentic and genuine, that he wasn't speaking down to them, that he wasn't being diminishing of them. And so I'm not arguing here to be a radical like we see on the left, where they behave badly and rudely and swing their junk around and stop people from speaking and scream and do all these kinds of things. I'm certainly not speaking for that. The kind of radicalism I'm talking about is a respectful radicalism, an empathetic radicalism, one that understands that the message that we have to impart to people, that we vitally have to impart, that it is our imperative, that it's almost an emergency at this point that we have to impart, is so important, and that it's going to be difficult for them to hear. We have to be empathetic to that, and we have to understand how they're hearing it, right? And so, that's my challenge to you today. And what we're seeing right now is in the libertarian movement in the States has, it's had its ups and downs, and I was very interested to see how Gary Johnson and Bill Weld were going to do in the last election. I was at the convention where they were selected as the president and the vice president nominees for the Libertarian Party, and Gary Johnson and Bill Weld, they're elder statesmen. They have records as governors. They meet all the establishment criteria. They weren't exactly the most principled, and they didn't seem to grok or really understand the principles of libertarianism. I wouldn't classify them as radicals in any stretch. And it turned a lot of libertarians away from the party. There was a lot of people complaining, and I was kind of upset by that. I thought, you'd be loyal to your guy. Like they're out there. You don't see Donald Trump people, throwing him under the bus and he's said some pretty deplorable things. You don't see Hillary Clinton supporters throwing her under the bus, even though she says some pretty deplorable things. Like, be true to your team, and then after the election, after the fight, reassess. But a lot of people had a lot of shots at the Libertarian Party, and they were legitimate. There was Tom Woods and Dave Smith and Scott Horton and all these people who were disappointed. They saw it as a missed opportunity, that as a basic, that a libertarian candidate, someone fighting for liberty, should come out swinging against interventionist wars, against taxation, against central banking, against the drug war. And these guys were kind of tepid on a lot of those issues. They weren't coming out swinging hard on them. So now what we're seeing, though, in the U.S. Libertarian Party is Scott Horton, the famous anti-war activist who I highly recommend you read his stuff, because he is just a compendium of knowledge on foreign intervention and all that stuff. He just bought a lifetime membership for the Libertarian Party. Tom Woods just bought a membership. Dave Smith bought a membership. All these heavy-hitting radicals who have huge followings because of their radicalism, by the way, because of their unprincipled, unapologetic approach, but their empathetic approach. They promote their radicalism in a way that's digestible, in a way that's approachable by people and doesn't turn people off. All these people are now jumping on board with the Libertarian Party, and they are promoting their, I'm trying to remember do you know, Walter, who the candidate they're supporting is? I can't remember. I'll have to, but they have a very principled, radical Libertarian candidate. And so that's what I'm hoping they field in the next election. I don't expect he's going to get a lot more votes than Gary Johnson and Bill Weld. In fact, he might even get less votes. But again, those votes mean nothing unless they're attached to a change in belief, right? And so if people simply park their vote with the Libertarian Party because they hate all the other candidates, that isn't any evidence that we're shifting culture whatsoever. What we need to know is this candidate going to create more libertarians? And I think he will, because Ron Paul did, because Murray Rothbard did, because Walter Block, this man sitting right here, a libertarian OG to the max, has created more libertarians. These guys can vote for liberty than any person in this room. That is how we get liberty. And there's Murray Rothbard makes a good qualification for liberty. He wrote an essay, I think it's actually part of his book, but it's called "Do You Hate the State?" And he was picking apart David Friedman. David Friedman is an anarcho-capitalist, and he wrote a book called The Machinery of Freedom. So he's come to the same conclusions as Rothbard, that the state is just evil, it's a threat to mankind, and it ought to be dismantled. But he comes to that conclusion for the wrong reasons, according to Rothbard. He doesn't come to it because he hates the state. He is he in fact doesn't mind the state. He's like, the state's all right, but it's just things get better when under an anarcho-capitalist structure. This isn't good enough for Rothbard. He says this guy isn't a radical. I will take a radical minarchist, a radical constitutionalist who hates the state over this anarcho-capitalist, this conservative anarcho-capitalist. He calls them conservative because they're kind of pragmatic. It's like their goal isn't isn't anti-state. It's in favor of something else, right? And so that's his point. And so this is my call to you, I guess. If you're with me and you think that government is downstream from culture, and you think that being a radical for liberty is the only way we change hearts and minds, like Ron Paul, like Walter Block, like Murray Rothbard, then join the party. Go to libertarian.ca, and by the way, I will give you, if you do it tonight, I've got some free t-shirts for you. If you go to libertarian.ca, join the party, we got some t-shirts for you. Yeah, and listen, I know there's, this has been a rough year for the Libertarian Party. We had the People's Party of Canada spring up, and, they had a lot of good things to say. I like what Maxime Bernier was saying about multiculturalism and diversity. But, I really wanted him, and I felt it was a huge missed opportunity to come out swinging against the state. He could have distanced himself from the Conservative Party by saying taxation is theft, by saying let's end the drug war, by saying let's end foreign interventionism, let's abolish taxation. But instead he said, we got too many immigrants and multiculturalism is a cult. And, he did what a pragmatic politician would do, which is, where's most of the support? Most of the support was going to come from populists. He had a real opportunity there. And so, I guess I'm imploring you, if you see benefit in radicalism and shifting culture, join the party, get a free t-shirt. And listen, if you don't like my leadership, if you think I'm a feckless leader, if I'm saying the wrong things or whatever, I've got like 2 supporters. Run for leader. It's not going to be that hard to replace me. Just show up at the next convention and
Where's that
Moen
gonna be?
come take it. It's yours. So I guess I'll leave it at that. I'm being told it's Q&A session, but does anyone have any questions at all for me? Donald, do you have any?
I know you very,
I used to know this guy from back in the day in Fort Mac.
Oh,
We
no.
have a long history, don't we?
Yeah, we do. I don't want to talk about it.
No, I don't want to either. That was
No, that's a violation.
Every different province has their own ideas of what move forward and everything like that. Back east is mostly the whole socialist idea and everything like that, but back west it's more open to freedom and everything else. And I'm thinking through the provinces themselves and through government do their own policies. Like here in BC we have ICBC, which is probably the most idiotic thing around.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering through these individual ideas, through individual processes or the
individual issues.
individual issues. And I feel that we could push the message
Yep.
of liberty through those things that pretty much the overwhelming population
Right.
just hates.
Yeah, absolutely. Those things are conversation starters, right? And they attract eyeballs. And so, Ron Paul, one of the reasons he got so successful was that there was a huge anti-war sentiment. They had so many pro-war presidents. They've been at war for so long. George Bush was pro-war. His opponent on the left was pro-war. And Ron Paul really capitalized on it and said, I'm the anti-war candidate. I've been preaching this stuff for years. And that brought them in, and then they saw the rest of his message, and they was taken in by that, right? So for sure, you can approach these issues, but one of the things is that I think really want to stress, I think it needs to be rooted in the deep philosophical roots of libertarianism, in the radicalism of libertarianism. And we have to be unapologetic about that. We have to be understanding but unapologetic. Like, for example, I remember I think it was 2014, we saw Breitbart start pushing this thing called cultural libertarianism. I don't know if you remember that, but they were pushing very hard against, they were advocating for free speech. They were worried about the erosion of free speech for especially conservative voices, and they were worried about immigrants. Okay, but they missed out on the radicalism part. To me, they weren't cultural libertarians so much as cultural conservatives, because they didn't understand free speech as a property right. That's all it is. And so you end up then advocating for statism. They wanted the state to make sure conservatives were able to have a voice on Facebook, on YouTube. They had legitimate gripes about immigration, but almost all the gripes about immigration had to do with statism. The welfare state, democracy itself, lack of property rights, all these things contribute to, immigration isn't a problem. So it was kind of like they were ignoring a rotting, gangrenous leg, and they were swatting away these flies and saying the flies are the problem. Well, okay, maybe swat away the flies, but you got to deal with that leg, right? And so it wasn't rooted in this, in radical libertarianism. So it kind of irked me that they were calling themselves cultural libertarianism when they were really advocating for statist policies to get them some kind of freedom that they thought they were lacking or something like that. But yeah, Donald.
Equalization payments, what do you think about that? Quebec getting a whole bunch of equalization payments from Alberta, and basically Quebec is now, pardon my tone, I'm going to use the bitching, because they're running out of propane. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, obviously I'm against any kind of wealth redistribution and tax. I mean, equalization payments come from our income tax, right?
Yeah.
So I want to abolish income tax.
Me too, and all that.
But it's baked right into our Constitution. Our Constitution is terrible. This is one of the things that bugs me too. Like just a pet peeve of mine with Max Bernier is he continually goes around saying we've got to respect the Constitution. The Constitution hasn't stopped human rights tribunals from taking comedians to court. It hasn't.
Like Jessica Neves and all that?
It supports equalization payments. It has weak property. It doesn't even have property rights in it. So this is why I say again, we need, and even like climate action. Okay, so he says we don't need climate action because there's no catastrophe coming. No. What I want him to say is a radical message that says if catastrophe is coming, we need liberty more than ever. We need to get government out of it. That to me is a radical message.
We do.
Time's up. All right, I'm gonna yield the floor. Time kind of flew. All right.
No, you're fine.
Thank you guys.
Go ahead.
No, I'm not fine because there's other speakers. So
never mind.